Looking for a cute and whimsical fall project for your home or fairy garden? Watch to learn how to make this pumpkin house on a jar so the windows will light. I'll share all the simple details that add up to one truly adorable fairy house. Hey there, Sandy here with another polymer clay tutorial at keepsakecrafts.net. We're going to build our fairy garden house on a glass jar. I recommend a straight-sided glass jar. You could also use one that's round if it's the same shape that you want your pumpkin house to be. And we're going to build it upside down on the jar so we can insert lights into the bottom. Next, you'll need some pumpkin colored clay. I emptied out my orange scrap clay bin and mixed it all, and I ended up with about 12 ounces of clay, 8 of which I used to make this larger pumpkin sculpture. I didn't mix it thoroughly either, kind of left it streaky. Now you want to roll balls of your pumpkin colored clay, and then roll them into logs that are a little shorter than your glass is tall. And the size of the balls is going to be, of course, proportionate to whatever size jar you have. And it might take a little bit of experimenting. I mean, this one was so big that each of these segments started out as one of these balls, and these were around 1.5 inches in diameter. You might have to do a little bit of experimenting to get something that's the right size. This ball's a little over 1 inch. So first you roll it smooth, get out any cracks or creases, and then roll it into a log. And I'm kind of looking at my design, from the not mixing thoroughly. So I'll roll it into a log with the designs going lengthwise. Just seems like it would be a little bit more natural. We want this to be just a little bit shorter than this is tall, and that looks like that will be just about right. Now use an acrylic roller to slightly flatten the log, so making it a little taller and quite a bit wider. And roll harder on the sides, so you can roll right off those sides to taper them. And I'm also going to kind of pull out these corners and make them square-ish again. And what you should have is a rounded shape that looks kind of like a crescent moon from the side. And it should be a little bit more than the height of your jar. I'm actually going to stretch this up just a bit. I'm going to pinch and compress and make it a little taller there, so that it almost reaches the center. On this one, it didn't reach the center even at all. And so I kind of had to position my leaves to cover that up, which isn't my favorite way of designing. All right, I'm going to flip that around because I do want that to reach the bottom. And then that goes up and over the top. Now repeat, you can roll logs, some that are wider than your first one, some that are going to be a little bit skinnier. And you'll fill the entire area around your glass jar. And where you have these seams at the indents, use your fingers to blend them smooth. Don't worry about making it absolutely perfect at this point. We have a couple more steps. Just make sure that the glass jar is covered all the way to the bottom. So here I've got most of my pumpkin ready to go. You can, if you're having trouble getting into those spaces, take a rounded tool handle, kind of press it in. That will help smoothing things out. Press it up and over. Just be careful, like here, I pressed right into the corner of the glass and ended up with a patch. I'll smooth it out as best I can, fill it in. Now, if you're happy with this shape, that's fine. But what I like to do to give it a little bit more rounded appearance, I think the top is fine. I just smooth that a little better. But use a craft knife to carve away some of the clay towards the bottom. Obviously not all of it, like I just did. So focus more on the center of those. Is it a lobe? I don't know. I'm sure there's a technical word for it. But focus more on the center. And we can always smooth it back down to fill in that bottom area. And that way it just has more of a rounded profile. But you could certainly make your pumpkin any shape you want. Experiment with different shapes of jars. You might take a look at a farmer's market or a farm stand and see some of those different shapes that you can make. Because squashes come in an amazing array of sizes and shapes and proportions. I'm just kind of doing a classic orange pumpkin here. And then you use your fingers to smooth out the cut edges and round and shape your pumpkin however you want. So that's really close to the edge, so I've got to stop pushing it down because it's just exposing the glass. And I don't like doing design by cover-up, where, oh, I'll just put a leaf to cover that up. Okay, well, maybe I don't want a leaf there in my final design. So I don't want to have to put one. So let's make it look good without a leaf. And if I want a leaf there, that's fine. I did that for years, designing things and making things that you had to cover up later, and I'm just over it. Let's do it right, do it well, and not have to cover things up. All right, so that'll do for now. That's pretty good. Next, I'm going to use a craft scratcher, which I think you can find. It's just a little wire brush. This was for scrapbooking, but you can use it for, I love using it for clay to give texture. Giving my pumpkin some texture. I'll use this later for the windows and doors for wood grain texture. And I'm just going over it, and then I'm going to smooth it out a bit because it's not quite that deeply textured, but it does have some like streaks on it. And we're going to add some colorants in a minute with pastels, and this texture will catch the pastels nicely. So go ahead and go over your whole thing, and then kind of just go back with your fingers and smooth it out somewhat so it looks like more like the texture of a vegetable that grows in your garden. Again, if you want to be realistic, take a look at pictures or the real thing. If you have a pumpkin somewhere this time of year, take a look at it. You'll probably notice a lot of things that I didn't include here, and you can add some but keep it fanciful. You can make it as realistic as you want. When I'm done with this, I like to clean it out with some rubbing alcohol so that the next time I do something, I'm not streaking orange bits into it. But you can buy little brass brushes for $1 or so at the hardware store. I do need to bring this down and make sure I'm covering the bottom of my glass. You can use a blade to just trim the excess clay from the bottom, and that will also help you see if you missed any areas. And then I'll kind of round that again just to soften that cut edge. Let's turn this pumpkin into a fairy house. I'm going to do that by using cutters to cut out a door and some windows. You could just use a blade and freeform cut. I love rounded arched doors, so I'm going to use this oval. So find the side that you like the best to be the front. I'm going to use this wide one right here. Position your door. And cut. Now remember, we're cutting into a rounded glass, so you kind of have to rock it a little bit. And then I'm just going to finish that cut. And I know the threads of the jar here don't look great, but don't worry, our door will cover that up. Yeah. see what I did here for this door. I just put the window light in the top half, and then that way this covered up the threads on the bottom of the jar. So let's see, so we've got our door and maybe a little round window over here. Kind of rock it side to side. There we go. And then I think I'm going to do a little diamond window over here. Just using a square cutter on a diagonal. And if you wanted, you could do another window in the back, like I did on this one. But for this little one, I think that's sufficient. You could, of course, if you wanted to, this almost looks like a creepy face, you could position your windows so that it looks more like a jack-o'-lantern face. Before we do the first bake, I'm going to add some chalk pastels just to give it some variation in color and depth. These are the colors of pan pastels I'm using. You could also add some green streaks in there. Often, if you look at pumpkins, they actually have a bit of green. And we'll just start with the lightest. And you don't want to like cover the whole thing, just kind of add like streaky areas. We'll add the most of the lightest color, and we'll add less and less of the two darker colors. And I'm concentrating this lighter one on the high points. So now I'll move to this kind of rusty color and go a little bit more like into the crease. Maybe some down here, maybe some up there. It just makes it look more interesting, then keeps it from looking like a plastic toy if you just add a little bit of variety. Also, the pastels give it a more matte appearance, which also helps it look a little less plasticky. Now I want to be careful. I feel like I maybe overdid the darks on this one. I don't know, maybe it's fine, but I kept looking at it wishing I hadn't put quite so much of the dark in. So I'm going to just tap off and not go maybe quite so heavy. And that I'm focusing in those creases. We'll also be dry brushing and adding paints after baking. But I really like how this takes away that shiny. You may want to take a little bit of time and clean up any of these cuts inside your windows. Easiest to do it now. And then you're going to bake this for anywhere from 1.5 hours to 2 hours. These are some pretty thick sections of polymer clay, and if you read your package directions, it will tell you for primo that you want to bake it for 1/2 hour per 1/4 inch. So if it's 1 inch thick, that means 2 hours. So I did bake this base for 2 hours. None of these are that thick, but I will probably bake it for a good 1.25 hours, just to make sure it's completely cured. Here's my pumpkin out of the oven, and now it's time to add some trim to our house. To make a wood grain cane for your house trim, roll a dark brown clay through the thickest setting of the pasta machine and a medium brown through a medium setting. You know, at this scale, this probably isn't necessary. I don't know how much of it shows after all of the texture and painting, but this is what I like to do. You could just use a solid colored clay if you want. So now we're going to stack the two colors and roll them again through the thickest setting of the pasta machine. Cut in half, stack, roll through. Maybe do it a little more straight than I just did. That's all right. Cut in half again, stack again. Yeah, I think one more time. You can see how thick these are. That's a little too thick. And now it's half as thick, and that's a good size as a wood grain. And now you're going to cut and stack these to make a cane. So you see these stripes. And you can cut slices from this. So that should do. Now I'm going to cut slices, probably, under 1/8 of an inch thick. And I'm going to run these through the pasta machine to make my trim. And when you roll this through, now if you went too far and you made these lines so then you can hardly see them, roll them through the pasta machine in this direction. This time we're going to do a medium setting, so like a 4 or 5. And you can see how doing it that way made those thin brown stripes wider. Again, at this scale, I don't know that it matters. If you go this way, you'll make it longer and the stripes won't get any wider. Whichever looks best for your project. And I actually like these ends where it goes off because then it is a little less regular for a wood grain. And I'm just going to put some of these slices side by side to make pieces that are wide enough for the shutters. Now to make your shutters the same shape as your windows, you're going to take your wood grain sheet and then gently press it right onto that opening, pressing the edges, and that way you'll create an impression. Now I wasn't thinking this through. If I want to make shutters for this, it's going to be awkward. So I think I might just make like rectangles instead of half triangles. So now you can see the shape for your shutters. Cut out your shape. And I wouldn't worry about perfection here. I kind of like it to be a little wonky. Then we're going to use our wire brush. And you don't have to go heavy, just go lightly over it to make some wood grain. I also like to kind of poke the edges. So it looks like wood that's been outside and maybe weathered a little bit. So they're kind of rough. And you can take a needle tool and make a few deeper lines. And I'm kind of trying to make them wiggly and not too straight. And then you can cut that in half and you have your 2 shutters. There's our 2 shutters. I think I'll just trim that one a little bit. There, so they're about the same size. Make all the shutters you want and set them aside for now. To make the door, take your wood grain sheet and lay it over the door. And again, just like with the windows, just lightly press onto the edges of the pumpkin to make an impression. However, this you want to cut out a little bit bigger because we're going to stick it to these edges. So it needs to be about 1/8 of an inch bigger all around. If you love projects like this and clear, detailed instruction, consider supporting this YouTube channel on Patreon. Patrons get weekly, behind-the-scenes sneak peeks, bonuses. Thank you to all of you who already support this channel on Patreon. I love you all. Join us at patreon.com/SandySewin. And back to your video. I could have had a slightly wider sheet, but that's okay. Put your door on a piece of paper. I found it's easiest to work on a piece of paper here. Now go ahead and give it the same texturing treatment. And then cut out a window. You can use a cutter or make a round cutter, a round shape, or just use your craft knife and make whatever shape you want. I'm just going to make a curved shape up here. This is why we've got it on the paper, just to support it, otherwise it's going to flop all over the place. Because of the position of my windows here, it would be a little weird to have the half triangle overlapping the door. So I'm going to do this one a little different. I've got the cutter I used to cut out that window. I'm just going to kind of use that as a guide and cut a square just a little bit bigger. Texture it. And then cut it in half. And I might stab it a little bit in the edges because I just like the way that looks. And let's see. Yeah, see, I think that will look good over that window. So set those aside for a minute because now we need to add the dividers for the windows, the window divider strips, which are called mullions and muntins, by the way. We're just going to take some of our brown clay and roll thin strands. And when you roll it, if it starts to shred, that means you've got an air pocket in there, and you probably just want to push out the air, roll it up in a ball, and try again. Then we're going to just flatten this slightly. It'll make it easier to handle and easier to add a texture to. And add just a few lines for texture. Before we go any further, it's very important to clean your windows because you won't be able to do it again easily. So I've just got a little rubbing alcohol in here. And a little sponge. I'll just get that all clean. Now we can add some liquid clay just to the edges, and I'm getting ready to add the window trim, so I'll add liquid clay to all of the edges, about an 1/8 inch or so from the edge. If you get any on the glass, it's really easiest if you just remove it right now. And now we'll add our window divider strips. You can make these neat and tidy and straight, or you can add them crooked and wonky, and just press that really well onto the edge of the pumpkin beside the window. Repeat for all of your windows. And for the door, we're just going to flip it over and add whatever you want for dividers to the back. So put your texture side down. Alright, I had to go make another door because that one was just falling apart. I'm adding the last of my little divider strips to this door light. And just lightly pressing them, and now I'll flip this over. And I can reinforce any texture on the front side, which will also help to kind of smush those window dividers right in place. Now you can add a little ball of clay here for a door handle. If you're making something bigger, you can add a metal finding of, this is just a little bit of a jewelry thing, I don't even know what it is, some kind of connector. You could press in a bead, and then after baking, you can pop it out and glue it back into place. So here I've added my mullions and muntins to both windows, and I've also added liquid clay all the way around the door, fairly wide out, like almost 1/2 inch out. I'm going to gently lift up my door and then carefully place it on. You just want none of the pumpkin to be showing up above it. That's not a good look. And then just Just press it down. And if you have to trim away the bottom, I would save doing that until after you've baked it. Now this door is small, so I'm fine, but this one, there was a considerable gap between the door and the glass, and I tucked a bit of tissue in there just to hold it in place while it baked. All right, so now we can add some trim around our windows and doors. And that's just these long strips that we've rolled out on a medium setting. Cut. Again, it depends on the size of your pumpkin. For these, I'm going to make them about 1/8 of an inch wide. I'll trim that end tidy. If there's excess of the window divider strips sticking out, you can trim those before you bake. And so just take your time. And like with the door, just have that trim covering the edge of the pumpkin. Oh, and I meant to texture this before I put it down. It's actually easier to do. You can do it if you forget, like I just did. It's easier to get most of the texture in place before you put it on the window. But you can do it, and it kind of helps press it in place too. And I'll kind of blend that seam a little. Yeah, it would have looked better if I'd done it first. Oh well. Yeah, and do pay attention when you're holding this, that you don't like pop in any of your other pieces. It's easy to do. At least I do it all the time, and end up squashing other parts that I'm not working on, which is annoying. So you're going to repeat this step to add trim around all of your windows and also another strip around your door, just like this. You can see this strip around the door and the windows. Just thought I'd show you, if you have a square opening and you want to do a little miter, just lay your strips on longer than they need to be and then trim from that corner straight out. And you can do 2 opposite sides, and then when you add the adjacent side, you just trim at the same angle. Like that. And then you can take a little time with your tools and kind of blend those edges together. And final detail before our next bake is to add the shutters. However, I didn't think this through on this small one. So this shutter looks fantastic over here, but this one's overlapping the door. So that's kind of an issue. I think I'll probably just put 1 shutter in place. And the same over here. I thought that would work, but not really. So you might want to take that into account. If you're making a smaller one, you need to leave room if you want to have shutters, which I think are a very cute detail. So I'm just going to have the one, and you know, if anybody wants to take issue with me about lack of shutters, proper shutters, well, sorry. You could see on this one I had just enough room to add the shutters on either side, so something to keep in mind. And once you have all those details, give this another bake for about half an hour. I did find on this big huge one, after baking for half an hour, because there was such a mass of clay and I had to lift something, it wasn't fully cured. I discovered it was crumbly, even though normally a piece this thick would be fully cured in half an hour. Because it was on this large quantity of clay, it wasn't. So something to keep in mind, but you can get it set so you can continue working without ruining things. I noticed that even this very small door is kind of collapsing, so I'm just tucking in a little bit of tissue, trying not to wreck things, not succeeding in not wrecking things. Yeah, you need far less than you might think. It was just the smallest bit of tissue there, and that will hold that in place while it bakes. Now it's entirely up to you. You can go ahead and bake, like I said, at this point, or if you want to live dangerously, like me, you can go ahead and make your window boxes at this point before you do this second bake. And what you'll need for each window box is a little rectangle that is the size you want your window box to be. You'll need 2 of those. And then you'll need to cut 2 triangles the height of your window box. So just do this. Lay your bit of clay and cut a strip that's the same height as your window box. And then, let me just cut that clean. Cut 2 little triangles. And the wider this edge, the wider your window box. You don't want to make it too crazy wide. You just want to be able to tuck in some little flowers. Now texture the one that's going to be on the front, just like we've been doing. Now lay your untextured rectangle on a tile. Add a little liquid clay to the 3 sides, so the 2 short sides, well, everything but the top opening. And then add your triangles, angled side against that side. And I found what works is to use the blunt edge of your blade and kind of just press that right on there. And make it stand up. Come on, stand up. I think I might have made that a little too deep. I'm going to make it a little more shallow. There. Oh, yeah. Sharp side for cutting works best. So we're making like a little V-shaped pocket as the window box. There, that works. And then we'll add liquid clay to these edges. And add your textured rectangle on all of that. Now the key here for making this all behave is to just let this sit for a while. This bottom edge you can kind of seal up. Just kind of add to the texture. Oh, and I forgot to texture those little side pieces. It's not crucial. If you think of it before you try to assemble it, go ahead. And it's not usually necessary. I didn't find it was necessary, but you may want to just tuck a little bit of tissue in there and just let it sit for a while. See, so what you have is this little pocket. And this is why I stuck it to a tile, so I can kind of lift it up, see what's going on. But what will happen is that the liquid clay will soak into the solid clay, the unbaked clay. Well, it's all unbaked. But the liquid clay will soak in. And you'll get a pretty decent bond. So I'm just going to see if I can gently stuff that. The most uncooperative piece of tissue ever. Come on. There. Just like that. And just let it sit on the tile for a little while. Go off and have a snack or something. To add your window box, just add liquid clay where you want it to go. And then carefully use a blade to release it from the tile. And this hasn't been sitting that long. Really, the length of time that it took me to make the other window box is all it's been sitting. And it's holding together pretty well, so we'll just ever so gently pop that into place. And this is where my favorite tool really comes in handy, a bent needle tool, because then you can get in there. Now this back is not going to be visible once you fill it with greenery and flowers, so go ahead and press it on there really well. Here's our pumpkin out of the oven with the window boxes and all the window and door trim. Pretty cute. Now it's time to add some leaves and a stem. Pumpkin leaves are heart-shaped with rounded lobes. So we'll start with just some green polymer clay that I've rolled out on like the second thickest setting of my pasta machine. And again, I just went into my scraps and I've got all different colors mixed in here, and I didn't mix it thoroughly. So you have some color variation. You can see on this one, the color variation in the clay along with the painting really gives it kind of a natural look. So I'll start by cutting out a heart. I'm just going to use my craft knife to kind of make some lobes. It doesn't matter. You could just do a heart-shaped leaf, honestly. You could do any shape. You could do a non-heart-shaped leaf. I just looked up what shape pumpkin leaves are and said, okay, I can do that. Kind of do that. There. This is silicone molding putty, and I made a mold of a leaf from my yard. If you want to learn more about using this stuff to mold just about anything, I'll link to a video I've done. So whichever side you want to be the top, put that side down, and I'm going to line up this major vein with that spot on the leaf. Put a little piece of deli paper on it, and I have here my favorite burnishing tool. This is a cabinet knob that I got at Home Depot. It's fantastic. The way you do it is you start in the center and just kind of press a little circle. And this was a fairly shallow texture, but especially when you have deeper textures, what this will do is anchor your clay in that texture. Then you can work your way out. Now for this leaf, I want to make sure, once I get it out, and you can feel it, you can't see it on camera, I'm pressing pretty hard, but I'm going to press on those edges as well. So I'm pushing it out so that it fills as much of that texture as it wants to, and then I'm just kind of rolling the knob over the edges to thin them, because I do not like that look of something, cookie cutter edges. So you could make your leaf very, very thick and sturdy, but by thinning the edges, you have the illusion of it being a very thin, natural leaf. See, doesn't that look cool? And now you can kind of pinch it right in the middle. Just gives it a little bit of shape and character. And then decide how many you want and where you want them on your pumpkin. And because I finished all this and made sure it all looks good, I have the freedom to put this wherever I want. So I think I kind of want it right there. As I mentioned with this one, I left that space. Oh, you can kind of see it on the inside. I left that space way too open, and so I had to use 3 leaves to cover it. Okay, last little bit of sculpting for this project is the stem. Just grab some of your brown clay, just some leftovers, and roll a log. Make one end wider for the base of the stem, so where it connects to the pumpkin. So I think that's the right width. And I'll just make this part a little skinnier. This is probably longer than I want, but that's okay. And I'm going to use a needle tool and just texture it lengthwise. I'm going to actually pinch that, spread it out a little. You can see that on this one, where I made it wider at the base. Why is it that when we go to a pumpkin patch and pick out pumpkins, we're always looking, at least I'm always looking for one with an interesting stem. I mean, I want a good shape to the pumpkin, but it doesn't do it for me unless the stem is interesting too. I don't know why. I mean, I don't know. To me, it's just an essential part of the form. Just give that a slight twist. Isn't that cool? It just looks so good. And I'm just going to trim this end off. You can trim it flush. I'm just going to trim it at an angle. And then use my needle tool and poke that severely, thoroughly, intently, entirely. if you ever look at the end of a stem where it's been taken from the plant, actually pumpkin stems are hollow, but you don't really see that at this point when it's all dried out. You just see this rough area. So give that a good stabbing all over there. And it may have thickened a bit. Now it looks like an elephant trunk, so we'll just thin that again. And then that, when you do that, it causes that to dip in, which is a good thing. Okay, so now we can assemble and do the final bake, and then it's on to fun details. I'm gonna cover this whole top with liquid clay because I'm not sure where my leaves are going to land. And that way I don't have to worry about whether or not there's liquid clay underneath. And I'll just have a thin, kind of feathered out at the edges layer of liquid clay, so if any but of it isn't covered by a leaf, it's not going to matter. Okay, so now I'm gonna pop on my stem. That's pretty cool. Shape it however you like. Add your leaves where you want. Because you designed your piece thoughtfully, you don't have to put them places to hide things. And if you need to, well, first of all, if you need to, boy, my leaves are kind of big, aren't they? I'm gonna have to actually cut that down. Okay, I'm back after having to drastically reduce the size of my leaves. Twice, actually. Yeah, sometimes, you make these design decisions, and if you haven't made a project before, it takes a little experimenting to get things right, and that's okay. It's better to take the time and redo it, and then you'll be happy with it. So that's much more in proportion. Use this soft little silicone tool and kind of tuck that in. And what you can do as you're baking, if you want it to have a certain shape, like I might want it a little curled up, you can just tuck a little bit of tissue under there, give it the shape you want, and then bake one last time for honestly an hour to an hour and a half to be sure the whole thing is fully cured. I mean, if you look at just the base of this stem is a 1/2 inch thick, which is an hour. So give it a good long cure so that your clay piece will last and not be crumbling. The final steps after giving your pumpkin its last bake are to add some paint touches and the flowers to the window boxes. You might notice here it's already done. That's because that footage went away. Don't know what happened to it, but that's okay. I got you. It's actually pretty simple. First, we want to antique the wooden trim and the leaves and stem of the pumpkin. What I love to use are high flow acrylics, and I've done a YouTube video showing how to do this really quickly, and I will link to that. After you've done the antiquing, and by the way, I don't usually antique the entire pumpkin because I think it ends up looking dingy. I just maybe do some areas, like here you could see where the high flow acrylic kind of went into these areas. And I didn't want the entire pumpkin to look like that, so just some areas have that. Be sure to let your antiquing dry completely before you move on to the dry brushing. And I'm going to dry brush the pumpkin with some pale yellow, just in little areas, mostly the high points. Also, the leaves get dry brushed with the pale yellow and a bright green, and the wooden trim gets dry brushed with bronze. Now here's a tip for you. I have a video for you for the antiquing, so let me just share with you this quick tip for dry brushing. It's called dry brushing for a reason, because you want to use a very dry brush. But the mistake a lot of folks make is that they don't use a dry enough brush. So what I'm doing here is getting my brush quite full of this bronze paint. And because all the other pieces are done, I actually did another window box for you. Now what you want to get is a piece of paper, and if you're dry brushing with white, get a colored piece of paper or cardstock, and brush off paint. And keep brushing and keep wiping until you don't see any more paint coming off. And that is when your brush is ready to dry brush. because you think, well, there's nothing on there, but there still is. Yeah, you can see it just a little bit. And now you can dry brush, and this hasn't been antiqued, but you can dry brush over that, and it just hits the high points. Do a little bit on this stem just so you can see it's just hitting the high points. There's just enough in there that you can go over it very lightly. Now let's do one of my favorite parts, which is adding the greenery and the flowers to the window boxes. We're going to start with moss from the craft store for greenery, and you just need to stick that in with some E6000 glue. If you want to know more about using E6000, I've done a whole video on that as well. But one of my favorite tips, well, two of my favorite tips actually, one of the most useful things I learned from someone else is to use these little tiny tubes, because if you've ever bought the great big tubes, I've never had a chance to use a whole one because it's always dried out by the time I get to it. The other thing is to only put down as much as you're going to use in a few minutes. So I just put down a tiny dab and use a toothpick to scoop up a little bit and just fill your window box. Get a good amount down into the window box. Now this one has a bigger opening than these two. I made it a little wider. The smaller the opening, just use real small amounts at a time. So I've got glue toothpick and poking toothpick. I have two different toothpicks. Just grab little bits of moss and use the toothpick to poke them down in there. I mean, honestly, if you didn't want flowers, that would be pretty cute just as it is. So this stuff has these kind of longish pieces, and what I did on this bigger pumpkin was use them as flower stems. So I glued flowers to them like they were stems. But this little pumpkin's kind of small for that. For flowers, I used these dried flowers I found on Amazon. They are for nail art, and they are the perfect proportion for this kind of project. So what you want to do is have your flowers upside down on your work surface. You'll see why. And then we'll have to put out a little bit more glue. Pick up just a tiny bit of glue on the toothpick. That's too much. Just enough to like fill that back center. Touch it to the back of the flower. Put it wherever you want on your window box, and then put your thumb over it and just twist and pull the toothpick, and that leaves your flower glued in place. Just twist and pull. And you just have to have a real delicate touch here with these. Once you're done filling your window boxes, you can add a strand of fairy lights. Now you know how to make this pumpkin house, but if you love fantasy and whimsy, you need to dive into the dragons and fantasy playlists I put together for you. See you in the next video.